Thank you, Grace. And we're now live streaming, team, and I think everyone's back at the, or almost back at the table, so we're going to get going and Councillor Halliday can join us. So we're just resuming the meeting, and I just want to note that Councillor Elliott had apologies and for lateness, and DEM Services have just passed that on to me, and Councillor Elliott's now here. So we'll just retrospectively note that in the report. We're now moving on to item number 9.2, found on page 9 in the paper. And again, just hand it over to Aston, I think, to walk us through the report. To Hamish. Hamish.
Thank you again. This is a regular policy work program update. It's been a little while. I think the last one we received and discussed was back in February at the start of the year. Since then, it's been a very busy time. And in that time, the report identifies a number of completions. I guess one of the key ones has been around the long-term plan, which has obviously been quite a significant project and undertaking for yourselves and council more generally. And there's been a number of other areas of work undertaken that are identified in the report. I was going to just take the report as read. The only other thing I was going to identify as part of the policy work program is, of course, at the last discussion we signalled the review of the 3-year policy work program that we currently have in front of us going forward for the next 3 years, and that's something that we now have underway. We're waiting till the end of the long-term plan process concluded so that we can kind of look and review and identify projects and undertakings under the policy framework that we might want to take forward, and we'll be looking to come back and discuss with yourselves and others to develop up what that work program looks like, with the intent of agreeing the new work program for the next 3 years by the end of the year. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamish. So just to make that really clear, there'll be a review of the policy work program that elected members will be able to feed into, and that will be conducted by the end of the year. I also want to just point out a couple of things, because just from experience around the table, that's come up before, and I've even been guilty of it myself, where we may raise a question around something not being finished within a certain time frame. And so under point 2, point 3, point 4, point 5, point 6, you'll see approved revised timelines. And so you will see some projects will be pushed out for various reasons, brought to this table, approved, and so forth. So you'll then see the tables which have the individual topics and the timeframes as well. So I have a few questions myself, and I'm just going to go to Councillor McCann, work around the table and see how we get on. I also remember in the past we've had questions about being able to read the flowchart. It's pretty busy, but I guess it highlights the amount of work that council staff and us as elected members participate in. So, Councillor McCann.
Thank you, through the chair. Firstly, want to recognise how extremely busy you are and all the work that council staff have got on, and then I want to go to my favourite topic, housing. On point 14 there, the subdivision development principles, will this work be done in time to feed into the first of the district plan changes? And does it need to be?
Just waiting to go red, Councillor. Mr. Chairman, if I can take that. The aim is to have that SPP completed and in front of you by January next year, and there is an alignment with the district plan work, and whether that's the right mechanism and whether that keeps us agile enough, those are the things we're exploring through the review process.
Thank you, and that's really the only major question I've got.
Thank you. Your Worship, the Mayor.
If Mr. Chairman, if you allow me some time preamble to frame my question. A lot of the strategy work, can you tell me if they are specific and danger is they become silo? So we have a range of strategies and new ones pop up. Do we have a handle on which strategies and policies need to talk to each other? And having said that, when you are developing a timeline for it, does the timeline, when you establish the timeline for the delivery of this, do you consider the relationship of the different strategies or policies? And my third factor covering that is, how do you coordinate that with the challenges that we're having in terms of national level changes that are coming in? I see risk in progressing those holistically. Is that a question that could be answered?
Yep, I think so.
Thank you. So yes, you're quite right that there are a range of different strategies which are interlinked or interface with each other quite heavily. An example of this would be the growth strategy and the open spaces strategy. We've made a decision recently, you'll see in the paper, for the consultation on the open spaces strategy to be deferred so that it can be better aligned with the growth strategy consultation. That's an example of us making sure that we're looking at how these things are going to be applied together and how they need to work together closely. So yes, that's happening at a practical level. In terms of how we consider these things in the scheduling itself, you'll see through the A3 that there are a number where there are arrows which reflect down onto additional strategies, so the sequencing of them is considered. And sometimes those interrelationships mean that a delay in one area has a flow-on impact into another strategy or policy, and we work around that as best as we can. The upcoming review gives us an opportunity to effectively start again with a bit of a clean slate. Because this was set back in 2018, some of the priorities might have changed, whether that's because of our work program and priorities or because of government's work program and priorities, and so it's a very appropriate time right now for us to be having that refresh and look at where things are placed. Does that answer everything, Your Worship?
I'm struggling to understand if the issues that we are dealing with here, as you have explained, whether that's a staff or management issue, where does the governance side come in terms of interfacing with that process? I think there's a role for governance to help navigate that in terms of directions. I see there's a tension in terms of staff having being at the cold face of this under huge pressure, developing strategies or timelines without the governance, number one, understanding what these are and be able to then contribute to those.
I think failed, Mr. Chair, through you. I said to Mr. Chair I shouldn't be speaking. That will be a sign of success. So thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'll reiterate what Natasha said. Really, the change has been the government's agenda, really, to this work which was agreed in 2018, and obviously that is significant. But if I reflect back to when these priorities were set, there was workshopping and the governance were totally involved in prioritising. What we haven't done is reprioritise all of that. In fact, we've said it's not helpful to keep reprioritising every 6 months just to make small changes to this program. So I think that next workshop will absolutely say, well, bearing in mind the government agenda and the scale of those changes, what will that mean? I don't want to anticipate what we'll come and say to you, other than that will be a very live conversation and it will be between us collaboratively, So governance will have a view on how important some of this is. Some of it's statutorily driven, of course, and we just have to do it. But where we can, we'll kind of go from a staff perspective, here's our input into what we think is important, we'll seek your input into what you think is important, and we'll find that happy space where you tell us what the answer is.
Thank you.
Everyone likes the happy space. Try and get there. Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the chair, as I guess the person who keeps banging on about the level of resourcing and having unsuccessfully trying to get you more resourcing for the stuff, I noticed that there's about 5 or 6 items on page 12 that are sort of on hold or waiting for resourcing and that sort of thing. How, given that we didn't allocate sort of the additional policy resourcing I was after in the long-term plan, how do we get that on track so that we don't have more things dropping off the radar? Or is this something that we've sort of got to address in next year's annual plan around resourcing and capacity issues for you guys? Because it is just the two of you sort of working on most of the stuff, isn't it? And then contracting in expertise when you've got the budget available.
Oh,
So I think. Thank you. So I think that'll be part of the conversation we need to have in terms of priorities with the full refresh, is looking at what all the priorities are collectively, and then what we've actually got the capacity to be doing. If there is a really strong desire around this table to be doing more than what we have capacity to do, then that would be something that we'd need to be bringing recommendations back in relation to the long-term, the annual plan round.
Thank you.
May I? I think you were successful from memory, though, Councillor. I'm pretty sure in the long-term plan we have allowed for more resources in the future years. So we just said right now, given it was a 7.8% rates increase, we didn't see that as being the highest priority. There's a 4-person policy work team, not 2. They're awesome, and you see a lot of them. But actually, if you recall, I just remind you that our higher priority was to re-establish our strategy unit, which we didn't have for some years. And so actually what we had done was slowly incorporate some strategy resource, which in a different way meshes with the work that the policy team does. One of the changes I think you'll see is where there's a mix of strategies and policies in this, you'll actually see largely 2 streams of work in future being resourced out of those. So we actually do have more resource this year, but the government has soaked it up quite nicely. Thank you very much.
Any further, Councillor?
No.
Councillor Hanford.
Cool. Kia ora. My question's just around the Climate Emergency Action Framework, and I've just looked at the title on here too. It says Climate Action Emergency Framework, so that's a minor change just from reading it then. But it says, so obviously we've adopted the principles for that framework and to be confirmed completion date of 2022. How does that work though with annual kind of reports coming back through that framework? So in terms of a completion date, what does that actually signal or mean when it will be kind of an ongoing thing that is refreshed through those annual reports? So I guess I'm just trying to flesh out when you say to be confirmed by 2022, what that actually means, or the completion date, 2022, what that means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that might reflect, previously we had looked at a strategy that would evolve over a longer period of time. Then we sort of worked through that and we got to the position where we're looking at getting the framework established sooner rather than later and bringing that to council to be ratified. And I think that to be confirmed in 2022 may be an error that relates to that previous conversation, because certainly the framework is now adopted and in place, and we're now looking at the action plans and the delivery associated with that and reporting back on it. So I think we just might need to modify that date in terms of that table, basically.
Thank you. I'm just waiting. I know there was a couple of other councillors. I think Pravanov was next and then Elliot.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously there is a lot on this policy work program. I just wanted to ask some clarity. So particularly on this here, it shows all the work that's on hold. And so, for example, I'm looking at the road naming and street numbering policy. So obviously it had a start time partway through last year, or towards the end of last year, but it would actually be quite useful to actually know when it was being put on hold, because there's no indication there, whether it was that actually has just occurred or whether that occurred some time ago.
I mean, we can look to see how we can do that maybe as part of the refresh going forward. I'm quite conscious that the policy work program and how it's presented is very busy, and through great discussions with yourselves, we've refined and added elements to that to help our reporting and discussions with you. So we can certainly look to do that. The decisions, though, around those processes sit back in the papers as we come through reporting, but we can see, we can have a look at what we can do presentationally as part of that discussion and future workshops with you about the future policy work program.
So it's quite useful, you know, you've got that black line that says indicates previous completion date. So something like that there, having a line in there would, you know, just on those red ones would be quite useful. So there's two ones that I wanted to, so obviously this is the policy work, and obviously there's lots of other work that's going on as well. And I suppose one of the ones is the renaming of state highway when it's revoked. And I'm just wondering how that fits into this program. That's the first one. And the other one is too, that I know that's been on somewhere in the process for some time, is basically a review of all the management plans for reserves, and I can't see where this fits in here either.
I think the roading one, and we'll come to staff, but I think it's more of a project than a policy or a bylaw. But the reserves management plan ones are obviously a separate question. So, do you want to respond?
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Chair. As the Chair has referenced, that is really a project rather than a policy work program item, and the current status of that was it was put on hold on the basis that it would be implemented once the highway had been revoked. So, so at the moment it got to a point in that process. There are a number of preferred names for sections of the road, and the decision was then made to, because we weren't able to rename it as a state highway, that we would need to wait until it was revoked and then look at implement those proposed name changes.
So in relation to that, does this policy here, road naming and street numbering, need to be landed before the revocation renaming would occur?
No, they're not. They're not linked. There was the process associated with that was a separate paper that went to council that defined the process to work through in terms of naming the state highway. This particular piece of work is outside of that and relates to that general process around naming street names.
Thank you. In relation to the
the management plans.
Yes.
There was a question around management plans.
Reserves.
So the question was around where management plans, the consideration of management plans on parks and reserves and so forth sit in the policy work program, or at all.
So I suppose, having an interest in this area, I know that there's been, over the last probably couple of years now, there's been talk about revising the management plans for reserves, and I don't see it on here, and I'm just wondering, obviously it's in a different work stream, but, you know, how that fits into there, and sort of, is that on hold, or is that got a time frame?
There currently, some have been completed and reviews, but there's a vast majority that still have a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of legal work actually in reserve management plans, so we're working through the review of those and the resourcing associated to enable those to be completed. They'd be separate to policy, obviously, but in terms of the work program, that's where we're at the moment. So there is money in the budgeting for the annual budget this year to review those reserve management plans and achieve that work. How we get through that, we yet to map out.
Sasha, just I guess to follow up on the councillor's question around, in response to your answer, how do elected members get oversight over that? Will that come through council papers in terms of the timeline and the process at some point when it's ready, or through strategy and operations? Cause I understand what the councillor is asking and I understand the response, but we're not quite sure with the oversight around it.
That's a good question. Through you, Chair, I think in terms of the plans themselves, they would be made available to view. Whether that's summarised in a report to council, I'll refer to strategy and planning on the best way forward for that in terms of democratic process.
Sure. I'll leave that to the team, to the staff to just talk about, and if there's need to update elected members later. Councillor Pravanov, did you have a final question?
Yes. So thank you. So I haven't heard about this for a long time, but it was the last time I did hear something was that there was going to be a revised management plan for all the reserves rather than individual ones. So has that now changed?
Can I make a suggestion here? Because this is not really relating to what we're talking about today, but not saying that the question isn't valid. So maybe if staff can come back to elected members offline just via an email, if that's...
Through you, Chair, we'll put together a process on how this will be undertaken. So Council have
I
those.
take it, yeah. I mean, you've heard the questions. I'm sure that you can come back with a response. And Grayson, if we could just note that as an action on that little register we've got going. Thank you. I hope that's okay. Councillor Pravanov. Councillor Hanford.
Sorry, just got one more question around the refresh of the Youth Action Plan. I'm aware that the Youth Council has just collated a whole bunch of survey responses from roughly 800 young people, and I don't seem to see that represented in here, the refresh of that kind of plan, which is adopted, as I understand it, by the Youth Council alongside Council. So I'm just wondering how or where that fits in with this, or if I've missed it, or yeah.
That's an ongoing part of the youth development program and will come to the council, but as I understand it, it's not usually shown in the policy work program because it's part of a different work program.
Yeah, just to expand to reinforce that really, this is not the council's work program. This is the council's policy work program, and so there's a lot of stuff that goes on outside of this, and we definitely. This is complicated enough. We don't want it to be the council's work program, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You would probably not have any white paper left on here, and then some ink dropping off the page. Councillor Elliott, I'm sorry you got bumped. You're next.
That's okay. That segues really well into what I was going to say, and that was I was going to ask if report writers would reconsider paragraph 22 on significance and engagement. Being that I have always found this in front of us as a really good snapshot of the actual load of work that the organisation undertakes, and always felt it would be really useful for the public to get a little bit of comms about, just how busy these teams in the organisation are. So that's just my suggestion that I can offer.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Randall, got you up next.
Yeah, thank you. It's a follow on from Councillor Hanford. And I know it's not under this program, it's been explained, but I've mentioned it before. Apart from the refresh for young people, there's also the aged update. And these kind of programs can go hand in hand.
Thank you, Councillor. It's noted as well. So I don't see any further questions there. I've got a couple myself, which I'll just work through quickly. The reimagining libraries, forgive me, I think you may have already explained it now that I think of it, the different approaches now being used, contributing to the timeframe extension. Have you briefed Council already on that? I think you might have.
Just in terms of progress and briefing on that, I'm not aware of any previous briefing from staff. However, in terms of update, we can provide that. There has been some research done, market research done in that regard, and so some progress has been made on the defining opportunities for libraries going forward.
Okay, thanks, Sasha. The other one is around the land audit number 3 on page, sorry, I should have referenced that, page 11. That's, is that the work that we originally, Councillor Scott and myself, requested some time ago? And the reason why I ask is June 2022, and I know it's a massive piece of work, I've seen the folder. Is that what we're referring to there?
Yes, it is. So, as notes in the report, that we've completed the first stage of that was to do a review of all of the land holdings that the council owns, excluding the road reserves. We've moved on to the second stage now, which is making sure there's a really clear ownership for within the council of that land, and we've been working through making sure that we still require the land where and to see whether or not it's actually available potentially for disposal or not.
Thank you. And the last one was the property strategy on page 12, number 7. Could get a little bit more of a expansion on what it specifically refers to. Obviously property, but the...
Yeah, so this was intended, again, this is raised by council who wanted a review done on the criteria used for strategic acquisitions. So that's what that piece of work will be looking at.
Thank you. I'll take a conversation offline with you around that one at the break, if that's okay. Just in regards to a recent inquiry I had. All right, I can't see any other names on the screen, and I'm just... That's right, that was that. We've done that. And so we've got the recommendations found on page 14 from 23 through to 25, and if an elected member is willing to move those recommendations, Councillor Elliott, seconded by Councillor McCann. Right of introduction.
I'd just like to thank staff, all 4 of you and your team, for your incredible amount of work that you put into this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Open it up for debate. Councillor Compton.
Yeah, just to echo Councillor Elliott's comments there around the work you've done and keep doing in the policy space, which is immense and constantly growing. And I'll repeat what I believe I probably said around about this time last year is, when we do this review process later this year, the nature of these things is that you always try and shovel more things in without taking things out of the bottom of the funnel. So when it comes to next year's annual plan, to consider the capacity of this team to actually deliver on all that stuff that we're doing, because one of the reasons why I did push for it, as the CEO noted, was because of all the stuff that's being shoveled down the pipeline on top of us from central government too, which isn't going to let up in the sort of short to medium term either. So just putting in my early plug for that for next year's annual plan.
Thank you, Councillor. Good reminder for us all. I can't see any more names or His Worship the Mayor.
My concern is, of course, the ability of governance to understand how the machine works. This is a key building or foundational work. As I said earlier, the amount of work changes that are coming, the ground is shifting in the local government sector. We have got business as usual stuff to do. In the meantime, we've got to interface with the changes so that the business as usual stuff is not made redundant. These are difficult times, so I think the workshop towards looking at this review is absolutely critical. We need to get our heads around where governance fits into this, because if we don't, then the engine can run by itself. Thank you.
Thank you. I did say that to the staff the other day. If there were no elected members, I'd get the work done. I don't see any further questions. So, right of reply, or is that waived? Right of reply.
Yeah, no, just once again, explaining the why to the public is incredibly important, and policy work team don't get much credos. It's not up front. It's not a flashy part of the organisation for sure, but it's very much the basis for which we do our work, and explaining that to the public, I do think, is really important.
Thank you, Councillor. So with that, I'm going to put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. And as Councillor Elliott has said, just noting the work that you and your team do, and appreciate all that work. So thank you. All right, team. We're now on to item number 9.3, found on page 16, and invite Ian up to the table. Good morning. Good morning. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. Back in May, you received a report regarding the LGFA draft SOI and also a presentation from Andrew Meikle of LGFA, who joined us that day. And the report you've got today contains the final SOI that they've now produced. There are two key changes that have been incorporated in the final document. The first relates to sustainability, and they've now included an explicit objective around furthering sustainability objectives around their own organisation, but also across the local government sector. And I'll note that in that discussion in May, that was a particular point that was talked about, and feedback was provided by councillors after that meeting to LGFA around that point. So it's certainly pleasing to see that that's been picked up. And the second change relates to the cost of funding, if you like. They've elected to reduce the margin that they charge on lending to councils by 5 basis points for new funding from the 1st of July. And I think that simply reflects the scale that LGFA have now reached. They've grown significantly, and rather than just accumulating growing profits within their organisation, they've elected to pass some of that benefit back to councils, beg your pardon, through the reduced margin. So we'll begin enjoying the benefit of that as we enter into new debt arrangements with them from now. In other respects, the final document is consistent with the draft that you received in May. So I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. And for the avoidance of doubt, definitely not back to councillors, okay? Just so don't need that conspiracy theory going around out there. Councillor Elliott, kudos to you as well, because I know that you raised the point around sustainability in the meeting. So any questions? Councillor Elliott up next.
No, just congratulations, really. Thank you so much. We had really great comms with your organisation, possibly yourself, straight after that. It was good, and it's great to see LGFA being so agile. Thank you, and leaders as well as us.
Councillor Halliday.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Look, just a general question. With all the LTPs that have gone in place, there's obviously a big uptake on capital expenditure right across the country. Is that going to impact on LGFA's ability to borrow the amounts that are needed to fund that as such? Is that going to be an issue at all? I know there's capacity questions with regards to whether councils have the capacity to fill those capital programs, but will the money be there as well, generally across the country, to be able to fund them as well?
Well, I've not suggested otherwise. Certainly they're factoring into their forecasts that based on LTP's significant growth. Noting Three Waters is still, an area of uncertainty, but they remain a very strong entity, AAA rated, plenty of interest in markets. They've been from markets in their bond issues. They've been oversubscribed consistently, I think, when they issue their bonds. So there's good demand for their materials. So no indication that they'll have problems.
Okay, I don't see any further questions. If an elected member would like to move the recommendations on page 18. Moved by Councillor Henford, seconded by Councillor Pravanov. Sorry, Councillor Pravanov. Right of introduction.
Just following on from what Councillor Elliott said, good to see that integration or the addition of some sustainability and climate wording, and hopefully that really carries through. So I'd just like to thank Jackie for working alongside me to do that, and thanks to Ian and the team.
Thank you. Open it up for debate. There is none. Right of reply waived. Going to put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, and that is carried. Thanks, Ian. Now moving on to page number 34, item number 9.4, which is the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. And welcome Aston and Hamish up to the table again. Sorry guys, I should have reshuffled the order for you. Getting in your Fitbit steps. So, page 34, team. And I'll hand it over to you guys.
Good morning, Chair and Councillors. The National Policy Statement on Urban Development's Q4 report, which you have in front of you, is for the period from 1st March 2021 to the 31st of May 2021. The highlights include consenting activity for the fourth quarter increasing from the third quarter, with building consents moving from 116 to 187. Resource consents increased very marginally from 66 to 67. However, the potential net additional dwellings from this have increased much more, from 53 to 135 in the latest quarter. Both resource and building consents have increased a lot when compared to the fourth quarter last year, alongside the number of potential net additional dwellings. We have house sales figures also increasing from December 2020 to March 2021, from 768,000 to 820,000. For the same period, the housing register showed that applications for social housing did increase in Kapiti from 173 to 180 registrations, which is very similar to the national trend. I will now take the report as read and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, Aston. Just before I move on to, I'll make Councillor McCann go last, but the others. I note the measures that we use as in relation to the number of consents issued and also the value. And the point that I want to get to is around, we know that construction costs have gone up massively, and labour costs, which are attached to that, material cost and so forth. So I just wondered how that, and it may not be able to be reflected, but we can look at the figure and go, oh gee, there's a lot happening there. It could be the same amount of activity as before, but just actually the cost of that has increased. So I'm not too sure whether there needs to be any consideration around that, or if it's just too complex to assess.
It's a good observation. I guess I can make 2 points indirectly towards that. My first point is with regards to the nature and types of activity that have been going on over the last few years. Alongside the increasing house prices, we've seen trends of people investing in their houses and substantive redevelopment, I guess, essentially, like putting on that extra bedroom or knocking on a second floor. So that has actually seen some of the previously and more historically the smaller natured building activities in regards to numbers and cost actually inflated. I think, though, more broadly, your point about costs and construction's been inflated is a very real one, and we're actually undertaking some work currently that I hope would be useful, getting some market analysis of what that looks like in current cost and build prices, not necessarily in Kapiti, but more Wellington-wide, and it'll be useful to compare that against what it was a few years ago, and I think that'll be, we'll bring that back to the table as well, because I think it is a key factor nationally. With constraints going on around COVID.
Thank you, because even in a simpler sense, a per metre rate would indicate that a little bit. But I honestly didn't bump you down the list, Councillor McCann, but we've got Councillor Randall next, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. My comment or question is that I'll be agreeing with whatever Councillor Compton is about to say. And even though I'm not aware of what he's about to say, I'm sure he's going to be correct.
Well, you've got a bit of a licence there now, Councillor Compton, so...
Oh my giddy aunt.
don't use that too liberally.
You can say anything you like now.
I'm lost for words, actually. Through the chair, there's media coverage earlier this week. I've got a few questions. So the first one is, there's media coverage earlier this week about the Wellington region being the only one of the Tier 1 urban authorities to not deliver the next tier of the housing and business assessment by the 31 July date. And the sort of excuse given out of Wellington City Council's Chief Planning Officer was around the complexity of it, and that the government's deadline was a well-intentioned but clumsy directive. Is it just the volume of the work, or are there other issues sort of working amongst the sort of 9 councils to get this done that are holding up getting that report until September?
Thank you. So I'll start off with a response, and if anyone wants more of a technical explanation, they can certainly ask it to Hamish. So it's partly volume, but it's also partly the complexity of the model that's being used. So and the number of councils involved. So we're the only region where there's such a large collection of councils who are working collaboratively on a model. We're also, because of the technical nature of the model, working with a technology firm to refine the model and make sure it's actually giving us data which makes sense on the ground as well. So there's been a significant, a much greater need to have ongoing liaison between individual staff within councils and the technology firm than what's been done previously. We don't know how other councils have approached it. Each set of regions, Tier 1 sets, have been doing it in a different way. But it's certainly a complex process that perhaps may not have been understood by the government at the time they set that time frame. Did you want to add anything else, Hamish?
I think you covered off well. It's around the complexity of the model.
The CE does.
I really do. Natasha's very diplomatic, as you'd expect, so I won't be. When you've got this many councils trying to work together, there's going to be someone slowing you down. And I've already said to you before that the IAF is another example where we're actually cursed. It's a strong word, but we're cursed with the blessing of them creating a regional grouping and requiring us to work through that grouping to get our applications in, when the council next door can put in their own application straight away. Well, actually they can't because they're part of our grouping, but let's go two doors down. And so what was kind of well-intentioned, regional spatial planning is a good thing. Now to say to us, you're all part of this same Tier 1 metro, and you have to put in your IAF applications as a group, you have to do this work as a group, or otherwise we're going to say you guys can't work together. And we're saying, well actually that's really unhelpful. Christchurch City or Auckland Council can put in a single piece of work and deliver it and look good. And we, with the best will in the world, will often just run into the odd obstacle where somebody can't quite deliver their piece of the puzzle on time, and it holds all of us up. And so I just find this quite disappointing and actually cheap point scoring by some politicians in Wellington. I quite liked Wellington Planning Officer's response personally. Maybe I wouldn't have said it, but because this is where these good ideas can backfire, and I think that's really unfortunate. It makes us look like there's something we're underperforming, and in fact, we aren't really. We're well onto this work and what it means.
Did you have further questions?
Yeah, I was going to, first, that was really, really helpful. I sort of suspected it was that those sorts of things all playing against each other. The other thing that was sort of mentioned in the media coverage was there was some discussion about the tools the government might have at their disposal if we don't deliver things like this on time. But my sort of understanding is that more applies to implementing the district plan changes that would be required under the MPS on urban development, and there's still plenty of lead-in time for that. Whereas this sort of report thing, there's not really anything they could do other than go to the media like this and try and embarrass people, is there?
I suspect we may a stern letter from either the Minister or somebody at the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and we'll see what they say in that.
A stern letter. I remember my mum getting some of those when I was at school. The final question I had, and it sort of picks up on the point that's been discussed around the whole construction costs and that sort of thing, and I guess some of the limitations of the reporting model we have for these quarterly reports. So dwellings are one thing, and we're seeing those skyrocket across the country. There's obviously issues around consents being turned into actual livable dwellings at the moment because of, obviously, you've got labour shortages, you've got building material shortages. Do we have any tools that would be reliable to understand over time how many new dwellings are coming online sort of on a quarterly basis without waiting for, say, the HBA to come back? Something, I don't know, it would be code of compliance, certificates or stuff like that. Is there some sort of metric like that where we can almost get consents in how they're converting into dwellings?
It's something we can look at as part of going forward. I guess part of that kind of pipeline at the moment, we use resource consents, which is, of course, not all resource consents get actioned, and that's why we've introduced the net potential capacity to actually understand what of all consents is actually creating new potential lots. So that's one area we've gone a bit further to try and identify what that latent capacity being created is. And then the next step that we've been looking at is obviously tracking the building consents against that, which is, again, a strong indicator, given that there's costs involved for people to seek building consent, that they are going to build. But again, it's not the absolute definitive that it's actually built and available. But part of the process we're doing now is trying to see whether we can actually track what's being built. And I guess the housing business assessment is one way we do that, even though it's a long few years away. So we can certainly look at what that extra step is to see how more regularly we can do it. One of the requirements that came in under, again, the more recent National Policy Statement update was to actually correlate back what the take-up is in capacity against areas as well, and we're some ways towards that with what we currently do, but that's an area we want to look at going forward as well, and we're just waiting. I guess, from my view, the most opportune time to look at that is once we've got a very clear growth strategy and urban development plan that supports that with new policies and what it's seeking, and then to support that with a very clear monitoring framework and the tools that can actually do this regular reporting and provide that frequency of good information, because that provides us the responsiveness to actually understand whether our policies and our changes are achieving what they should be, and then if not, what we can think about doing about it.
Cool. Perfect. Thank you.
Bit long-winded.
Councillor McCann, it's your moment.
Oh, I moved myself down to be last, like you suggested. So.
Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've got 2 or 3 questions actually. So the first one relates to the table, the bottom table on page 38. So here it's got nominal mean rent. So I'm interested in these figures because I know that previously I've asked about data on rents, and I suppose the question is, there's 2 parts to this. One is, how is that actually based on the number of people who are renting? That's the first part, but also 2, I'm just looking at the lag in times for that information, and why is there a lag in because that information, please.
The lag is essentially because we use the information that's provided through Housing Ministry of Housing and Urban Development dashboard. They update it regularly in 6 months periods, give or take. So when and how these fall due, we're able to kind of like fold those in. Having said that, some of the indicators aren't updated as frequently as others. So obviously you'll be quite aware that the house values is something that's updated pretty much every report we bring to you, because that's quite a regular and available one. Even though that's lagged by the time it gets to you, you'll be well aware that the media usually also publish updated, more recent figures on it. And with regards to the data and what it includes, my understanding, and we can come back and confirm this with you if needed, but it's actually identifying rents lodged through MB, the Tenancies Tribunal, I think, is the use of the indicator and where the data source comes from to understand what that change in the annual, the weekly rent levels coming in is my understanding is the data source for that.
Would it potentially be the bonds that are lodged?
Yes.
Okay,
sorry, yep,
and that has
tenancy.
a figure. Okay, interesting.
It's my understanding, but if you're interested, I can provide the information.
Okay, so that's my first question, and then over it's a few pages over, page 43. So it's great that you have broken this data down by location, and I'm just wondering whether that's by ward boundary or whether that's by the mesh block electoral system, because I see here you've got Waikanae, but then you've got Peka Peka, Te Horo, Kaitawa, and to me Peka Peka seems closer to Waikanae, so I'm just trying to figure out where the lines are basically.
Aston's inherited this, so I'll probably best talk to that. I think this is largely it's suburbs that's used in our reporting templates that we capture. So I think it's largely suburban area based, and so we've aggregated that on a kind of spatial level. So it's not trying to define specifically to wards or to areas like that, but correlates to some of the building consent information that we capture and report on, and we try to group it in relative areas that relate to our housing areas that we refer to in the housing business assessment.
Okay, thank you. So then my other question relates to, I suppose, the resource consents for net dwellings for Waikanae, and how that seems to be, I actually worked it out to be 42% of all over the whole year, 42% of the resource consents. Is there any particular reason for that?
Sorry.
So we're just reporting on the activity that comes through. So there have been a few large developments in Waikanae, and that's what those numbers represent.
Okay, thank you.
Just got one last one before we move to Councillor McCann, and that is on page 38. It says a number of indicators continue to be less frequently updated on the HUD's dashboard. Any explanation behind why? What?
I guess it depends on where they're seeking the information from, and some of them aren't annualised or quarterly reports, so it does depend on the frequency of where the information's captured, or some of them are down to some analysis of data sets that they do less frequently, where it might require their research to do to provide the indicator, as opposed to it coming through from systems and processes such as building consent data.
Yeah, because the way that I read it, it sounded like a trend that less and less are being updated, and it's starting to drop off. Yeah, so that didn't read too well. Yeah, okay. Councillor McCann. Oh, sorry. Natasha, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add that the requirement that the government has imposed on us to make these reports on a quarterly basis, yet all of the data is not provided to us on a quarterly basis. So we can report on our data quarterly, but there's a range of central government-driven data which comes annually or something different.
Thank you for that clarification. Hence why I asked the question, because reading between the lines, that's how I read it, and it's helpful to understand that's the issue. Councillor McCann, over to you. And if when you're finished, want to move the recommendations, that would be helpful too.
Leaving last to least to last. Thank you very much for the report, and obviously I think this reporting is really important because it helps set trends. So probably following Councillor Compton's line of questioning, do you see the trends of increased activity going to put a significant strain on the current level of staffing and resources that we have around building consents, or not?
That's probably not fair on the policy team, but they're welcome to make a comment.
I will take every opportunity I can.
James.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can take that. Councillors, we are engaged a bit of workforce planning for us, particularly in the resource and building consent areas, and looking at the growth numbers year on year. We're probably looking at an annual growth of 20% of building consents. We will need to be putting some bids in the annual plan for additional resource, but I want to do that with some science behind it, and give you a reasonable business case for that. You may have heard the Chief Executive from Master Builders on the radio this morning. From an industry perspective, there's a lot of poaching of builders going on, and given the constraints of COVID and immigration, and been able to bring migrant workers, the same is very true with our technical people. Councils around the country are poaching staff left, right and centre, and it becomes a money go round, and so there will be some challenges for us in terms of meeting the regional market remuneration and attractiveness. All of that will go into that workforce plan that we'll bring through SAP, and probably put in, if not beforehand, a bit into the annual plan that will start later this year. I hope that helps.
Thanks, James.
I think the opportunity of this report does allow us to look at some of those trends and ask relevant questions. So apologies if the questions aren't going to the presenters. With one of the things that's occurring in our community is that there is a lack of houses for sale. Are we seeing a trend towards more redevelopment of properties and subdivision? And again, will that put a different kind of strain because it may be a lower level operators requiring council services and support?
I don't think we have really good metadata on that. Give you a simple example that we're all very aware of. There's a location nearby where there are currently 8 very rundown houses going to be replaced by 78 units. So I'd call that quite a bit of intensification. I think that the economics of building and infill probably mean that a lot of people are thinking about, it probably stacks up more now than it would have. You might recall Hamish walking you through the kind of the theoretical, I think it was 24,000 infill and greenfields developments that we could have in the district, it came down to about 4,000 that were feasible and economic. And I suspect that given prices, notwithstanding shortage of builders, that a lot more people, that'll be a bigger number than 4,000 now that people would be feasible and economic. But I don't, to go back to my first comment, we don't have really good data to give you an indication whether that is or isn't in the pipeline.
With latitude, Mr. Chair, for this next question, some building developers have been selling properties or developments without going through the consenting plan or the consenting process, or haven't got through that yet. What difficulties does that place on our council when people are purchasing properties with an expectation but they haven't gone through the consenting process?
Again, I'm happy to take a stab at it, but it puts us in a very, very difficult position in terms of trying to strike that balance between growth and the tension around good growth and a good development. And the complicating feature for Kapiti is our easy to develop land has kind of gone, and you're seeing that come through now with liquefaction and additional cost for developers to do. So it puts both Sean's team and particularly the planning and the building consents teams in a really difficult position. It's just an added pressure. Notwithstanding that's what the market permits, but I think we exchanged emails where one is completely sold out and the resource consent hasn't been issued, and that brings another layer of complexity and tension when the technical staff are saying no, it needs to be done this way. So we just need to work through that with the sector. But presents difficulties for sure.
And just to follow up on Councillor Compton's question regarding the media and the government, are we responding in any way to the comments from the Minister, which, as you suggested, seemed quite harsh? Or is it going to be unhelpful to
hadn't
clarify?
considered that we would let Wellington be in the middle of that stink. In our business, everybody takes cracks, don't they? And if we responded to every single one of them, we wouldn't actually be doing the job. So my starting point is let's just focus on getting the stuff done and prove by delivery. So if it's a little slow, I've explained our reason for it. But ultimately, more reports isn't getting houses built. And so, our primary focus as an organisation internally in that space is let's talk to the people who are going to get houses built, and let's make progress in that space. To do that, we have to make sure we've got a strategy that shows where greenfields development can happen. We need a district plan to be updated to allow more intensification and more height. So, we've got to focus on those things as well as convincing people this is a good place to build houses. And we're working hard on that, and we will bear the fruits over the coming year or two.
Thanks. And I know the team are currently surveying around building consents, which I think is great. Councillor McCann, did you have further? I have got Councillor Compton, and I can come back to you if you want to. Councillor Compton?
First, I was just going to say, I would make a joke about us pushing Wellington in front of the buses, but they don't. The buses all get cancelled down there, so that would be a fruitless endeavour. Just picking up on the earlier discussion that Councillor Cootes brought up about the government not updating those figures that we need for our quarterly report. And picking up what Councillor McCann just said, can we send them a sternly worded letter about not updating their data for us?
Maybe we could put that over to the housing portfolio to write a sternly. No, I'm joking. All right, noted. But the staff will take that on board. Councillor McCann, did you have any further questions? And if not, would you like to move the recommendations?
No further questions.
I don't see anyone else. So we've got the recommendations found on page 35. Councillor, would you like to move those? And seconded by Councillor Compton. Right of introduction.
I'll make this very brief. I think this reporting is really helpful in that it does provide information on the trends and directions, and which is why I think we should use these opportunities to ask some of those questions that clearly are not for the policy team but are interrelated. And I just note how many moving parts, and I think the CE was suggesting that just before, there is so many moving parts in the preparation for the significant development that is already here but is going to ramp up. So Keep up the great work, and that's across the whole team that's interrelated with housing.
Thanks, Councillor Compton.
If Councillor Randall's going to agree with what I'm going to say, if I agree with everything that Councillor McCann's going to say, does that sort of flow on? I wanted to sort of echo those comments around thanking the team for everything they've done in this space. I think what we've seen is since these sorts of the first lot of these housing business capacity assessments were brought in a few years ago now, they've actually built up this big case for actually getting the big chunky policy setting changes that we need in the housing sector to address the crisis, and now we're starting to see the changes required for that coming through in the MPS on urban development. So I think this sort of data collecting has been fantastic for basically making the case of why things need to change, and now the bit we're getting to now is getting the tinkering right, so we have the right sort of monitoring going forward, which is really, really important. So just commend you and the team for the great work that you do on this, and looking forward obviously to seeing the big updated report in September when the regional one comes out.
Councillor Elliott.
Doug, thank you very much for this report. I've got to say, out of all the paperwork we received, this is one that I do put into the hands of builders myself in a hard copy and make them sit down and read it. It's really, really quite valid that they get that information and see how they're tracking. I'd like to also note that I really loved seeing the kōrero mai survey on your building consent experience up there, front footing this work stream. It's fantastic to see. Thank you. And looking forward to hearing the feedback and how that's analysed. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor McCann, right of reply.
I'd just like to comment, I'm very excited that Councillor Randall, through Councillor Compton, agrees with me. Very excited.
Thank you. I was interested to see a crib in there. I don't think I've seen crib in the report before. So I was... All right, so I'm going to put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. And once again, thanks team for presenting. All right, lastly, we are on to the confirmation of minutes found on page 44 of the report. Councillor Randall.
Yeah, clarification. Page 49, why is the committee resolution moved by Councillor Gwyn Compton and Councillor Robert McCann? Why is that mentioned in the ordinary minutes when that was decided in public excluded? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, my understanding is it's always recorded the moving into publicly excluded and moving out, but I could be wrong. The Chief Executive's nodding his head, so I think that's a standard practice to record both the moving in and the moving out of publicly excluded in terms of transparency.
It's an academic exercise, but if you're moving in public excluded, it should be in public excluded that you move out.
I also get what you mean, but I guess there are other matters that are released from publicly excluded and not necessarily the whole report, and you could say that that's an example where the moving and seconded is automatically released. I don't know if you want to make a comment. It's worth...
Oh, it's a valid point you raised, Councillor. It just, I guess from our perspective, it would seem odd for there not to have been a clarity of that resolution to move out. Otherwise, we could never close the meeting either. We could maybe find some wording differently, that the meeting moved out of public excluded, and leave the resolution in there if you really wished. We could look at it, but if you're just treating it as an academic exercise, we probably won't change anything.
I was going to say, how else would we know we'd come out of public exclusion?
That's right, we might still be in there. Forever. Thank you, Councillor Randall, for that position. Yeah, that's right. Councillor Compton I saw next, but it's now gone off the screen. Okay, Councillor Pravanov.
Yeah, so just following up on that comment, it's basically like a line. So when you're in public excluded, you actually go out of it, but then when you go over the line, you come back into the public meeting, and then you close it. So this here should be about be coming back into public meeting. What's written here? And then that's a separate thing here down the bottom.
All right, well, the team will take that away. I do want to reiterate, that's the same wording that's been used for every council meeting, strategy and operations meeting, strategy and policy meeting, and so forth over the trienniums. But there's no further points to be raised out of the minutes. Councillor Elliott.
Yes, just that if we are on the same minute, the 17th of June, look, I noted as not present and not an apology, but once again, an email through to DEM Services was sent that I was unable to attend that meeting. So can I just...
I'll get DEM Services just to follow up that offline, and if that's
Thank you.
appropriate and if it's okay for me to.
So the apologies noted at point 3.
Thank you, Grayson. So it's already in there, Councillor.
Oh, right, right. It was above that.
I had. Thank you. I had one matter to raise regarding page 46 around Mr. Mansell. And I just wondered for clarity, just given that we were at pains to do it properly, it refers to Mr. Mansell spoke in public speaking time. And I just wondered whether in that wording it needed to note that he left the table to speak. I may be being pedantic, but it's not clear, and given that he's a member, we're at pains to do that properly. So if we could amend that to say that he left the table to speak in public speaking. Thank you. So if there's no further questions raised out of the minutes, if someone could move the minutes for the resolution on page 44. It's moved by Councillor McCann, seconded by Councillor Randall. Randall, yes, no, yes, thank you, Bernie. Any further discussion? All those in favour say aye. Aye, against, and that is carried. And just checking my report, no public speaking time, so I'm going to call the meeting to a close, and thank you all for attending. Thank you, staff, for your support. We've got one action there that we're going to follow up offline, and appreciate you all attending the meeting.